It started with an innocent mistake. I had spent the morning tidying up the house, an endless cycle of folding laundry, dusting shelves, and trying to ignore the quiet emptiness that had settled over my life in recent years. Derek, my stepson, had left a trail of chaos after moving back home from college a month ago. Between his laundry strewn across the couch and the steady stream of his friends coming and going, the house was livelier than it had been in years. And yet, I still felt like a ghost floating through it. That day, I found myself in his room, determined to reclaim some semblance of order. I pushed open the door without a second thought, balancing a basket of clean clothes on my hip. What I wasn't expecting was Jake. He was standing near the bed, his back to me, shirtless and mid-change. My breath hitched before I could stop it. His broad shoulders and defined back were illuminated by the soft afternoon light streaming through the window. "Whoa!" Jake exclaimed, spinning around as he hurriedly pulled his t-shirt over his head. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I stammered, the laundry basket nearly slipping from my hands as I turned on my heel. "It's fine," he said quickly, his voice filled with amusement. "I didn't think anyone was home." I paused in the doorway, feeling my cheeks burn. "I should have knocked. I thought Derek was here." Jake laughed softly, the sound warm and familiar. "He ran out to pick up lunch. I'm just grabbing my stuff." When I finally dared to glance back, his easy smile disarmed me. He wasn't embarrassed, not like I was. If anything, he seemed almost amused by my flustered reaction. "Well," I said, clearing my throat, "I'll just leave these here." I placed the basket on the edge of the bed and fled the room, my heart racing. Jake had always been a fixture in our lives. He and Derek had been inseparable since they were kids, practically growing up in this house. I used to watch them tear through the backyard, muddy and full of energy, while I sipped coffee on the porch. But Jake wasn't a kid anymore. At 25, he'd grown into someone I barely recognized. Confident, charming, with a sharp wit and a quiet intensity that had a way of filling the room. I hadn't noticed the shift until that moment in Derek's room, and now I couldn't stop noticing. Later that evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, Jake wandered in, leaning casually against the counter. "Hey," he said, his tone light. "Sorry about earlier. Didn't mean to give you a heart attack." I forced a laugh, though the memory of his bare shoulders still lingered in the back of my mind. "No harm done. Just knock next time," I teased, hoping to deflect my own awkwardness. "Fair enough," he said, flashing me that easy grin. "So what's for dinner?" "Lasagna," I replied, gesturing to the pan in the oven. "You're welcome to stay, if you're hungry." "I'm always hungry," he said with a wink, grabbing a glass of water. As he moved around the kitchen, there was a new ease to his presence, a quiet confidence that I hadn't noticed before. He asked about my day, about the projects I was working on around the house, and listened intently as I spoke. It was such a simple interaction, but it left me feeling seen. After dinner, Derek and Jake retreated to the living room to watch a game, their laughter filling the house. I lingered in the kitchen, cleaning up but finding it hard to focus. My mind kept drifting back to that moment in Derek's room. The way Jake had looked at me, the casualness of his smile, the way his presence seemed to linger long after he'd left the room. For years, I'd been living on autopilot, my days a blur of chores and quiet evenings spent alone. Since my husband's passing, I'd thrown myself into keeping the house running, convincing myself that was enough. But lately, with Derek and Jake around, the house had started to feel alive again. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain, Jake's presence had started to feel different. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into a fleeting moment. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Jake wasn't just Derek's friend anymore. And the thought both terrified and thrilled me. The following days passed in a blur of ordinary routines, yet I couldn't shake the lingering effects of that fleeting encounter with Jake. I told myself it was nothing, a harmless, awkward moment that would fade with time. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more aware I became of him. Jake's visits to the house had become more frequent, a byproduct of his friendship with Derek and his new job nearby. He'd stop by for meals, hang out in the living room, and occasionally help with small projects around the house. Each time he walked through the door, the energy in the house shifted, and I found myself torn between wanting to avoid him and hoping for his company. One afternoon, as I stood in the backyard pruning the rose bushes, I heard footsteps behind me. "Need some help?" Jake's voice was warm, laced with a playful edge. I turned to find him standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his easy smile disarming as always. "I think I've got it," I replied, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Come on," he said, stepping closer. "You've got dirt all over you. You could use an extra set of hands." I laughed despite myself, handing him the clippers. "Fine, but don't butcher them. These roses have been here longer than you." "Noted," he said, his grin widening as he crouched down beside me. As we worked side by side, the conversation flowed easily. Jake had always been good at filling the silence, his quick wit and humor keeping things light. But today there was something different in his tone, something quieter, more thoughtful. "You've done a great job keeping this place up," he said, gesturing to the garden. "Thanks," I said, pausing to wipe my hands on my jeans. "It's a lot of work, but it keeps me busy." Jake glanced at me, his expression softening. "You do everything around here, don't you?" I shrugged, trying to downplay the compliment. "It's just me. Someone has to." "Well, you make it look easy," he said, his voice quieter now. The sincerity in his words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Jake told me about his new job, the challenges he was facing, and the long hours he'd been putting in. "It's not what I expected," he admitted, setting the clippers down. "But it feels good to be doing something on my own, you know?" I nodded, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "It suits you," I said, and I meant it. There was a confidence in him now, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. He smiled, his gaze lingering on mine for just a moment too long. "Thanks, Claire, that means a lot." Later, as we gathered the clippings and cleaned up, our hands brushed briefly, and I felt a spark, subtle but undeniable. I glanced up at him, my breath catching when I saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken. "Thanks for the help," I said quickly, stepping back to create some distance. "Anytime," he replied, his tone light but his gaze steady. As he walked back toward the house, I stood there, the clippers still in my hand, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't or wouldn't name. That evening, as I prepared dinner, Jake wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of garlic and herbs. "Something smells amazing," he said, leaning against the counter. "It's just spaghetti," I said, laughing softly. "If this is just spaghetti, then I'm staying for dinner," he said with a grin. I shook my head but couldn't help the smile tugging at my lips. "Fine. But you're on dish duty." "Deal," he said, grabbing plates from the cupboard without being asked. As we sat down to eat, Derek joined us, his easy banter filling the room. But my attention kept drifting to Jake. The way he laughed, the way he listened intently when I spoke, the way his presence seemed to ground the space around him. At one point, I caught his gaze across the table, and the warmth in his eyes made my breath hitch. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else would have noticed, but it left me unsettled in the best and worst ways. After dinner, as Jake washed the dishes and Derek disappeared upstairs, I found myself lingering in the kitchen. "You didn't have to stay and help," I said, leaning against the counter. "I don't mind," he replied, glancing over his shoulder with a smile. For a moment, the only sound was the clink of plates and the rush of water from the sink. Then Jake spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You don't give yourself enough credit, you know." I frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "You do so much for everyone," he said, shutting off the water and turning to face me. "But I don't think anyone's taking care of you." The sincerity in his voice left me speechless. I looked away, the weight of his words settling over me. "I'm fine," I said, though the words felt hollow. "You deserve more than fine, Claire," he said, his voice steady but soft. When I finally met his gaze, there was something in his eyes that made my chest tighten, an honesty that I wasn't ready to face. "Good night, Jake," I said quietly, retreating before I could let myself feel too much. As I lay in bed that night, his words echoed in my mind. "You deserve more than fine." I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. How much I needed someone to see me, not as Derek's stepmother or a widow, but as a woman. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to wonder. What if he was right? The next morning, I found Jake in the backyard again, this time tinkering with the squeaky garden gate that had driven me crazy for months. He didn't ask if I needed it fixed, he just took it upon himself, as if sensing the little things I didn't have the energy to manage. "You know, I could have called someone to fix that," I said, stepping onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. Jake looked up, the sunlight catching the mischievous glint in his eyes. "Why call someone when I'm right here?" "Fair point," I said, smiling despite myself. As he tightened the last screw, I couldn't help but admire how comfortable he seemed, how he moved through my life with such ease, like he belonged here. "Try it now," he said, stepping back and gesturing to the gate. I pushed it open, and for the first time in years, it didn't squeak. "Impressive," I said, handing him the coffee as a reward. "Glad to help," he replied, taking a sip before leaning casually against the porch railing. We ended up sitting together on the steps, the morning air crisp and quiet. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so at ease, just sitting and talking to someone. "So, what's next on the to-do list?" he asked, glancing at me with that easy smile of his. "I think the question is, what's next on your to-do list?" I countered. "Don't you have your own life to worry about?" He shrugged, his smile softening. "I like being here. It feels good." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I appreciate everything you've been doing," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "But you don't have to take care of me, Jake." "Maybe I want to," he said, his gaze steady. The simplicity of his statement left me breathless. I felt my defenses begin to crack, the wall I'd built around myself slowly crumbling under the weight of his kindness. We sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension between us growing thicker with each passing moment. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. I glanced at him, startled by the question. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but it's hard to leave something so full of memories." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Memories are important, but they're not everything." I stared down at my coffee, his words stirring something deep within me. "Maybe not," I said softly, "but they're all I've had for so long." That evening, after Derek had gone out to meet friends, Jake lingered in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. I found myself standing in the doorway, watching him, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I couldn't say. "Hey," he said, noticing me. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, stepping into the room. "Just tired." He turned off the TV and sat up, his attention fully on me now. "Want to sit?" he asked, patting the spot next to him on the couch. I hesitated, but the warmth in his gaze drew me in. I sat down, careful to keep a small distance between us, though the space felt charged. We talked about everything and nothing, our voices low in the quiet of the house. Jake told me more about his work, his plans, and the doubts he carried about whether he was on the right path. "It's hard," he admitted, "feeling like you're supposed to have it all figured out, but you don't." "I think that's everyone," I said, my voice soft. "I'm twice your age, and I still don't have it all figured out." He laughed quietly, his gaze lingering on mine. "You seem like you do," he said. "I'm a good actress," I replied, smiling faintly. The conversation grew more personal, the walls between us crumbling with every word. I found myself telling him things I hadn't said out loud in years, how lonely I'd been since my husband's passing, how I felt like I was just going through the motions. Jake listened intently, his expression soft and full of understanding. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly. "Maybe," I said, my voice trembling, "but sometimes, I don't want to be strong anymore." He reached out then, his hand covering mine. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight that left me breathless. "You don't have to do it all alone," he said, his voice low. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that terrified and thrilled me all at once. "Jake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't a good idea." "Why not?" he asked gently, his thumb brushing against my hand. "Because it's complicated," I said, pulling my hand away. "Everything worth having is," he replied, his voice steady. The conviction in his words left me speechless, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the TV in the background. Eventually I stood, my heart racing. "Good night, Jake," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Good night, Claire," he replied, his gaze never leaving mine. As I walked upstairs, I felt the weight of his words pressing against me, the quiet promise of something I wasn't sure I could let myself want. In the quiet of my room, I stood by the window, staring out at the darkened yard. For so long, I'd convinced myself that my life was over, that I'd had my chance at happiness and lost it. But now, with Jake's words echoing in my mind, I found myself wondering, what if there was more? The next morning, the house was quieter than usual. Derek had left early for work, and the absence of his usual noise left the space feeling strangely intimate. I found myself in the kitchen, absently wiping down the counters when Jake wandered in, hair still damp from his shower. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Morning," I replied, my gaze flickering to the coffee pot. "Help yourself." He poured a cup and leaned against the counter, watching me with a small smile. "You always this busy?" "It keeps me sane," I said lightly, though I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. "You don't have to do everything, you know," he said softly. The simplicity of his words caught me off guard, and I looked at him, my chest tightening. By mid-morning, we found ourselves in the garage, sorting through boxes that hadn't been touched in years. It had started as a casual suggestion, but the task quickly became a shared endeavor, our laughter echoing in the confined space as we unearthed old memories. "Look at this," Jake said, holding up a faded Polaroid of Derek and himself as kids. They were both covered in mud, their grins wide and unapologetic. "I remember that day," I said, smiling despite myself. "You two tracked dirt through the entire house." Paul was furious. Jake laughed, setting the photo aside. "We thought we were invincible back then." "You were," I said quietly, the memory tugging at something deep inside me. He looked at me then, his expression softening. "You've always been so good to us, Claire." The sincerity in his voice left me momentarily breathless. As the hours passed, the task grew lighter, the conversation turning to dreams and plans. Jake told me about the places he wanted to travel, the things he wanted to accomplish, and I listened, captivated by his quiet determination. At one point, I reached for a box at the same time he did, our hands brushing briefly. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back quickly, my heart racing. "Sorry," I said, my voice unsteady. "Don't be," he replied, his gaze steady. The moment hung between us, charged and heavy, but neither of us moved to break it. Later, as we stood by the workbench organizing tools, Jake turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Claire," he said, his voice quieter now. "Yes?" He hesitated, his hands resting on the edge of the bench. "Do you ever think about more?" The question caught me off guard, and I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. "More?" I echoed. "With your life," he said, his gaze meeting mine. "What you want, what makes you happy?" I swallowed hard, his words cutting through me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've spent so long just getting through the days. I don't think I've let myself think about it." "You should," he said softly. "You deserve to." The weight of his words lingered long after we'd finished in the garage. That evening, as we sat on the back porch, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, I found myself replaying the day in my mind. Jake sat beside me, his presence steady and grounding. "You've done so much for everyone else," he said suddenly. "When do you do something for you?" I glanced at him, startled by the question. "I don't know how to," I said honestly. "Maybe it's time to learn," he replied, his voice low but firm. The conversation shifted something in me, and as the evening wore on, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Jake's words weren't just a challenge. They were an invitation. By the time Derek came home, I'd retreated to the kitchen, needing space to collect myself. But even as I scrubbed the counters and tidied the dishes, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath me was shifting. The next day, Jake and I found ourselves working on the living room together, rearranging furniture and patching up a few scuffed walls. The task was simple enough, but every glance, every accidental touch felt magnified, as if the room itself was conspiring to draw us closer. At one point, as I stood on a step stool to hang a picture, I felt the stool wobble beneath me. "Careful," Jake said, stepping forward to steady it. "I'm fine," I insisted, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He placed his hands on my waist to keep me steady, his touch warm and firm. "Let me help," he said, his voice close to my ear. The moment was brief, but it left me breathless. When I stepped down, I turned to thank him, only to find him standing closer than I'd realized. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. "Claire," he said softly, his gaze searching mine. "Jake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither of us moved, the space between us charged with unspoken tension. I started, but the words caught in my throat. "Should you?" he asked gently, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite name. I didn't know how to respond, so I turned away, retreating to the kitchen under the guise of needing water. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. For years, I'd convinced myself that my life was set, that my role as a widow and stepmother defined me. But now, with Jake's presence and his quiet insistence that I deserved more, I couldn't help but wonder. What if he was right? The house was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that amplified every sound, every movement. Derek had left to spend the weekend with friends, and for the first time in days, it was just Jake and me. I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta on the stove, the rhythmic clink of the wooden spoon against the pot the only sound. The air felt heavy, charged with the tension that had been building between us. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, soft but deliberate, as he walked into the kitchen. "Smells good," Jake said, his voice low. "Thanks," I replied, not looking up, afraid my eyes would betray me. "Need any help?" he asked, moving closer, his presence impossible to ignore. "No, I've got it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He lingered near the counter, his gaze on me, and I could feel it like a physical touch. "You always do, don't you?" he said softly. I turned to him then, startled by the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" "You take care of everyone, Claire," he said, his eyes steady on mine. "But who takes care of you?" The question hung in the air, raw and unanswerable. I felt my chest tighten, a lump forming in my throat. "I don't need." "Yes, you do," he interrupted gently, stepping closer. The space between us felt impossibly small, and I could feel my resolve weakening under the intensity of his gaze. "Jake, you don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to be everything for everyone all the time." His words unraveled something inside me, a knot I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Without thinking, I turned off the stove and set the spoon down, my hands trembling. When I finally looked up at him, the vulnerability in his expression mirrored my own. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. "Because I care about you," he said, his voice steady and certain. "More than I probably should." The honesty in his words left me breathless, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was both tentative and desperate. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and longing spilling into that single moment. His hands rested gently on my waist as if he were afraid I might pull away, but I didn't. I couldn't. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. "This is crazy," I said, my voice shaky. "Maybe," he replied, his hands still holding me steady, "but it feels right." I searched his eyes, looking for doubt, but there was none. Only sincerity and a quiet determination that made my heart ache. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of whispered words and stolen touches. We moved to the living room, the dim light of the table lamp casting a warm glow over the space. We sat close, our knees brushing as we talked, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Jake told me about his fears, his dreams, the weight of expectations he'd been carrying. And I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't before, sharing parts of myself I'd kept hidden even from those closest to me. "You deserve to be happy, Claire," he said at one point, his hand covering mine. The simplicity of his statement brought tears to my eyes, and I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Later, as the night deepened, the atmosphere between us shifted again. Jake leaned in, his gaze searching mine, and I felt the air leave the room. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, his hand brushing lightly against my cheek. "Yes," I said, the single word carrying more certainty than I'd felt in years. What followed was a slow, deliberate exploration of everything we'd been holding back. His touch was gentle, reverent, as though he were memorizing every detail. And for the first time in years, I felt truly seen, truly cherished. We lay together on the couch afterward, the silence between us filled with unspoken understanding. His arm was draped over my shoulders, his fingers tracing idle patterns on my arm. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the quiet. "More than okay," I replied, Resting my head against his chest, he pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his touch grounding and comforting. "Good," he said simply. The reality of what had happened began to sink in as the night wore on. I knew the path we'd just stepped onto wouldn't be easy. There were questions, complications, and the ever-present fear of what Derek might think if he knew. But for the first time in years, I felt alive, and for now, that was enough. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, as if reading my thoughts. "Together?" I asked, my voice tentative. "Together," he promised, his grip on me tightening slightly. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what it might hold, because with Jake by my side, I knew we could face whatever came next. The morning after was filled with quiet stillness. The sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the living room in soft, golden light. I woke up on the couch, tucked under Jake's arm, the blanket draped over us like a shield from the outside world. For a moment, I allowed myself to just be, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the warmth of his presence. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. When Jake stirred, his arm tightened around me for just a second before he opened his eyes. A small, sleepy smile crossed his face, and I couldn't help but return it. "Morning," he said softly, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither of us moved to get up, as if breaking this moment would bring the weight of reality crashing back down. Eventually, Jake sat up, his hand brushing lightly over my hair. "How are you feeling?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Confused," I admitted. "But happy." His smile widened slightly, and he reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. "Okay," I said, nodding. "One step at a time." The simplicity of his promise brought a strange sense of comfort. For so long, I'd been afraid to let myself feel, to let myself hope. But now, with Jake by my side, I was starting to believe that maybe I didn't have to do it all alone. The day passed quietly. Jake stayed to help me finish a few projects around the house, his presence steady and reassuring. It felt easy, like we'd settled into something unspoken but understood. But as the hours slipped by, the reality of our situation began to creep back in. Derek would be home that evening, and with him came the inevitable questions and complications. Jake noticed my tension as we worked in the kitchen, his hand brushing lightly against my arm. "Talk to me," he said gently. I turned to him, my chest tight with worry. "What if this doesn't work? What if we can't?" He cut me off, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out, Claire, together." His confidence was unwavering, and though doubt still lingered in my mind, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. That evening, as Jake prepared to leave, we stood by the front door, the air between us filled with unspoken words. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on my arms. "I've never been more sure about anything," he said, his gaze steady on mine. The sincerity in his words brought tears to my eyes, and I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. When Derek arrived home, the house felt quieter, though Jake's presence still lingered in every corner. I found myself stealing glances at the couch where we'd shared so much the night before. The memories of his touch still fresh in my mind. Derek didn't notice my distraction, too busy recounting stories from his weekend with friends. But I couldn't help wondering how he would react if he knew the truth, if he knew about Jake and me. The thought terrified me, but it also made me realize something. For the first time in years, I was living for myself. The days that followed were a delicate balance of navigating this new reality. Jake kept his promise, calling every night and stopping by whenever he could. Each visit felt like a small piece of something bigger. A quiet reassurance that we were building something worth fighting for. There were moments of doubt, moments when the fear of what we were doing threatened to overwhelm me. But every time, Jake was there, his presence grounding me, reminding me that I didn't have to face this alone. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Jake reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I know this isn't easy," he said quietly. "It's not," I admitted, my voice soft, "but it's worth it." He turned to me then, his expression serious. "You're worth it, Claire." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my chest tighten with emotion. For so long, I'd convinced myself that I didn't deserve this, that my life was meant to be lived in the shadow of loss. But Jake's words, his presence, made me believe otherwise. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship grew stronger, though we kept it quiet, navigating the delicate balance of our circumstances. The house, once a place of quiet loneliness, had become a space of warmth and renewal. The rooms we'd worked on together felt like symbols of something bigger, something new and full of possibility. One afternoon, as we finished painting the final room, Jake turned to me, his eyes soft but full of determination. "This house feels different now," he said. "It does," I agreed, smiling as I looked around. "That's because of you," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Tears filled my eyes, and I reached for his hand, had my heart full. "No," I said softly, "it's because of us." The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. Because with Jake by my side, I knew we could face anything, together.